I am honored to have Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation with us today to talk a little bit about the problems with government stimulus, the problems with increased monetary supply, the problems with increased credit in the marketplace, and what happens to tax rates when this all needs to be paid back somehow. So
at IB Canada Group, we are your complete and independent source on the infinite banking concept, serving Canadians from coast to coast.
Franco, thank you very much for coming on. We met each other when you were on the Cross Canada truck tour in Victoria, BC. How did the event go?
It was good. Yes, we met each other on the kickoff of our national debt clock tour, where we had the big truck that had this huge digital display showing the federal government's $1 trillion plus debt going up in real time, going up by more than $1,000 every single second. It went really well. We took the debt clock all across Canada, coast to coast. We were on the road for maybe 6-7 weeks in total. We started out in Victoria, we ended in Halifax, and we met a lot of Canadians along the way, asked them why they were worried about the debt. And I think it really kind of falls into 5 things that we heard from Canadians about why they're concerned about the $1 trillion and growing federal debt. So number one, it's a one that I think we can all understand, but look, we can't afford higher taxes to pay for all of this debt. Number 2, we heard that politicians have been spending way too much money for way too long, and I can kind of get into those numbers a little bit as well. Another thing that we heard was that people are just worried that more money is going to be wasted on debt interest payments because of the higher and higher debt. Number 4, we heard that people are worried about inflation and are worried that as debt continues to run wild, inflation will continue to grow. And number 5, which we heard, which was probably the biggest concern, is that Canadians are worried about the type of country that they're leaving to their kids and their grandkids. Right now, the $1 trillion federal debt means that each Canadian is on the hook for about $30,000 each. By 2070, that number is expected to reach $67,000 per person owing to the federal government for their debt. So many Canadians want to leave their kids a chance and grandkids a chance at financial success in the future and are very worried that this debt problem is going to be hard to do that.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, of prime concern for people that when they look at their families, they look at how the country was run, maybe in successive prior generations, and what was the legacy that we're leaving for each next generation. And at you've got the numbers there. I'm going to ask you this question, but philosophically, we are mortgaging our children and their future. Their future success is going to be hampered by or sometimes somebody might say selfish decisions to increase social spending today. I mean, certainly there are things that need our attention. I have my opinion, those don't necessarily need to come from the state, but that's a recording for another time. But Franco, on point number 2, tell us what some of the numbers that you have about prior years spending.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing, which we have to remember is we have to take all of this debt and all of the spending during the pandemic within context. And here's the important context that we need to remember. Before the pandemic, before any cross-Canada recession, in 2018, the federal government was spending all-time highs, even after accounting for inflation and population changes, okay? So let me break that down even further because it works breaking down. In 2018, the Trudeau government spent more money than the federal government did during any single year during World War II. Again, adjusted for inflation and population changes, okay? So with the amount of spending that the government was doing before the pandemic, before any cross-Canada recession, finding savings in every single area of the budget should have been like finding water in the ocean. Now, one thing that we hear often is, okay, well, didn't all of this money have to be spent during the pandemic? Well, I think we can definitely arm wrestle on certain programs, right? Like, I think a no-brainer is that political parties should have not been eligible to dip their snouts into the taxpayer trough and help themselves to the wage subsidy that was meant for struggling restaurants and gym owners. Okay, I think that one is pretty obvious. But here's the question I think we all need to ask. How come when a family or a business stumbles into tough times, they're forced to make decisions? They're forced to choose what spending they need to prioritize and what spending they maybe just don't need and is more of a nice to have. Well, we did not see that from the federal government at all. Essentially, what we've seen from the federal government is just spend more money on everything forever. Okay, this federal government is using the cover of COVID-19 to go on a debt-fueled spending binge for years to come. What we should have seen from the federal government was let's say a pandemic spending rule, where any dollar they allocate towards the pandemic, they find a dollar of savings somewhere else in the budget. And remember, that is more than doable when you have this government spending all-time highs before the pandemic.
And certainly, are we getting the value for the money? Are we getting deliverables for the things that, like, there's a lot of, how many, you may have the numbers off the top of your head, but how many hundreds of millions of dollars was spent for PPE or respirators, and how many of those things were actually, like, I think one thing that people seem to forget is just because a company gets a subsidy bailout doesn't mean that they're ever going to get paid back. Of course, the Daimler Chrysler write-off of $2.4 billion a couple of years prior to the pandemic. That was actually was a loan granted by under the Harper government, I believe, but then was written off during Trudeau's earlier years. But do we actually have any numbers around how much was spent and how much actual economic value was added?
That's a tough number to really pinpoint. And I'm sure there are studies, and I'm sure there's going to be studies in the future looking at that. I mean, probably going to see some multiple PhD dissertations in the future kind of reviewing all of this. But we have to remember that it's very difficult to spend or to calculate because you're inherently talking about counterfactuals, right? Well, where would have this money had been spent had the government not spent it? Because remember, there is no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to government spending. Right? They're either borrowing from other private lenders, so that money could have gone somewhere else. They're either spending money out of taxpayers' money, right? What they collect through taxes. And of course, taxpayers could have spent that money somewhere else, or they're spending money that they get from the printing press, which of course reduces the value of our own money, which obviously could have been spent somewhere else. So it's very difficult to put that into context, or at least to measure counterfactuals. But you asked me about value for money. I talked about the national debt clock tour I was just on, right? Coast to coast. One of the things that we talk about with government are the roads, of course, right? Well, let me tell you, I mean, the roads aren't very good in Canada for all this money that we're spending to fund all levels of government. I mean, the roads were pretty bad all across Canada. I was actually quite surprised just how bad the quality of the roads were. And now you mentioned some corporate welfare. Well, let me talk to you about another corporate welfare announcement that was a few years ago that even led to less jobs. You had the Trudeau government and the Ford government in Ontario that combined together for hundreds of millions of dollars for corporate welfare for the Ford Motor Company to retool one of its plants, I believe in Oakville, Ontario, and it ended up leading to less jobs. So I mean, even there, obviously extremely debatable. We debate it all the time that corporate welfare does not lead to jobs, but even there, it's a pretty black and white issue of hundreds of millions of dollars going to a corporation that leads to fewer jobs.
Yeah. And I think that we see that Henry Hazlitt, for anybody
yes.
watching this who hasn't read Economics in One Lesson, you need to go right now, stop this video, go to your local bookstore or whatever online source that you go to and order. My preference would be that you go right to the Foundation of Economic Education and get one for free. Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, where he talks about a storekeeper who has his store vandalized. And instead of buying new materials to buy suits, he's got to spend this money. It's a redistribution of that money. And government, to your point, Franco, man, the value of our dollars, this is being recorded June 1st, 2022. And do we have any idea what the actual inflation rate based on the increase of, certainly on one hand is the government spending money, but then it's all that money that's being spent is being deposited into the banking system. The banking system is expanding credit and fueling these prices, fueling the not only monetary quantity, but also the monetary velocity. And that's when you see all else being equal, when you have more people spending more money, you're going to lead to increased prices. Franco, what on point number 5, which I thought was very poignant. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit and just give us some ideas about, excuse me, what some of the sentiment was, and did it differ from side to side or from coast to coast?
And that was on about the future generations, the concern of future generations. Is that right? Okay, so, well, I think people are just so concerned. You know, I don't have kids myself, but speaking just with my parents, one thing that they always said is that they hope that they can provide me with a better life than what they had, or that maybe I don't have to struggle as much as they did. I mean, my mom worked her tail off for a long time, single mother, raising my younger brother and sister. And yeah, she worked so hard and to provide us all with a better life. And I'm fortunate enough, I think, to have that. But that was a concern that we heard all across the road. It didn't matter what province you're in, whether you were in St. John, New Brunswick, or whether you were in Lloydminster, Alberta, or Saskatchewan, I guess, for that matter. But that was like the constant theme. Everyone is worried about that. And I think when we talk about debt, you know, it is right to be worried about the debt that we're piling on future generations, and how it's really unfair because you have taxpayers today voting on policies that are really going to be paid for by taxpayers tomorrow. And this is a huge concern. But one thing that I want to talk about and that I want to make clear is that debt doesn't just harm future generations of taxpayers. We are seeing it right now that the government's out of control deficits, that the massive debt is impacting Canadians today. And that's through the inflation tax. And let me break it down, because what we saw during the pandemic is we saw a fundamentally different way in how the government essentially raises revenue, right? We have seen the printing press on overdrive during the pandemic. So the last numbers I looked at from the Bank of Canada was that during the pandemic, the Bank of Canada printed $350 billion around there, right out of thin air, by purchasing financial assets such as Canada or Government of Canada bonds or Government of Canada debt, right? And we have to remember that the more dollars that the Bank of Canada prints, the less that your dollars in your bank account or in your savings account will buy. Okay, let me provide you another example of how close this is. So on April the 19th of 2021, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announced her 2021 budget, and the deficit worked out to about $3 billion per week. 2 days later, the Bank of Canada announces that it's going to be printing or purchasing government bonds with newly printed money to the tune of, you guessed it, $3 billion per week. Now, if that doesn't sound like Ottawa using the printing press to finance a good chunk of its deficits, then I don't know what does, right? And that's essentially Ottawa raising its revenue by devaluing the value of your money. That's the inflation tax, pure and simple. Now, do you mind if I just keep going on and addressing a few different arguments? Okay. So one argument that we've heard is that, well, this is a global phenomenon. Okay. And to an extent, many places, this is a global phenomenon, right? But guess what? When you have other countries running crazy deficits, when you have other countries having their printing press on overdrive, what do you expect to happen? And not every country has experienced this massive inflation, right? The last I looked, you have countries like Japan and Switzerland. Now, this is from a few months ago, but they weren't experiencing the crazy out of control inflation, right? Now, another thing that we hear, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I think this is important, is that you hear, well, this is just supply side. This is just supply side. Well, there's two things to talk about. Number one is that we have supply disruptions every year. All the time, you have random supply side disruptions, whether it's a bad frost in Mexico, whether it's a refinery in Texas shutting down. There are always supply side disruptions. The difference between then and what we're facing now is that you had the printing press on overdrive, and you had 2 years of revolving government lockdowns that completely hammers output. And now you have politicians understand or realizing that turning on an economy isn't as easy as turning on the light switch in the bathroom. Okay. But number two, and I think this is the real point, how you know that this is a monetary phenomenon is this. If it wasn't a monetary phenomenon, you would see some prices rising, but then some prices necessarily declining, right? Because if you only have $100 and a price goes from 50 to 60, well, you only have $40 left to spend on other goods rather than 50. So that's how you know that it's the extra dollars in the economy that is allowing this general price increase across the board. Essentially, what we've seen is we've seen the government create the perfect storm for inflation, which is too many dollars chasing too few goods.
Yeah. And I would add to that people are saying, well, if we printed all this money in 2020, why didn't we see the inflation in 2020? And that from an economics perspective, that comes back to velocity, how quickly people are spending money in the economy. And you go back to some of the 1960 inflations in the US, where certainly a great example is Weimar Germany. The first year or two of the hyperinflation didn't start off as a hyperinflation. It started off as a massive, before prices started to rise. Let's just say your basket of groceries was $50, but you had an extra $100. Well, those prices, you would save that extra $50. And you wouldn't start seeing until prices started to increase based on either the supply side or now that people really realize the psychological side of inflation as people are stressed and worried, which I think really speaks to the point about what kind of legacy am I leaving, the emotional psychological side of humanity. But
yeah,
we didn't see prices rise in consumer goods until just late 2021, really exponentially. But it always goes, the initial monetary quantity always goes to assets first, because it's extra money still. Prices haven't crept up yet, so people have all this extra money. Well, I'm going to get into the stock market. I'm going to buy a new house, and look at just carte blanche across Canada, the real estate prices that have gone up in 2020, 2021, and then consumer prices later. So yeah, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I'll add three things in terms of inflation. One is a more historical look at what happened compared to before. So for your listeners or your audience, check out a column in the Toronto Sun. There's two columns in the Toronto Sun, or one in the Toronto Sun called it's called Deficit Spending and the Inflation Tax by me, Franco Terrazzano, and it kind of lays down these data points. Another similar one in the Financial Post called Governments Created the Perfect Storm for Inflation, again by Franco Terrazzano, just because it has all the links to the data that I'm about to talk about so that you can cross-reference in case I misstate something offhand. But essentially, the last that I ran the numbers, both in those columns, you had the printing press, the central bank, its balance sheet increased by like more than 300% during the pandemic, during the 2 years of the pandemic, which is significantly more than from the beginning of 2008 all the way up to pre-pandemic, which is significantly more than the recession of the 90s, the 80s, and the 70s. In fact, the percentage growth in the Bank of Canada's balance sheet rivaled the entire 6 years of World War II. Okay, so a lot of times in this space, we hear about, the 08-09 recession and the printing press or something like that, right? But what happened over the 2 years of the pandemic dwarfs the amount of new dollars printed up by the Bank of Canada in the 08-09 recession, for example. Okay, so check out those columns. It has all the data there. But that's the one thing I wanted to make clear, is that this is way different than what we saw in recent recessions, way different response. Number two, the other thing I want to talk about is that inflation is a fundamentally undemocratic form of taxation. Okay, so for example, everyone knows when a politician or politicians raise the sales tax by a point or raise the income tax. Everyone knows that, right? People lose their minds when that happens. But how many politicians in Ottawa even know that the Bank of Canada printed hundreds of billions of dollars during the pandemic? How many know the exact amount? And that's just politicians in Ottawa. What about like everyday Canadians who are worried about getting their kids to school, then to hockey practice, I guess soccer practice now, right? It's a fundamentally undemocratic form of taxation. The third thing that I want to highlight, and this goes all the way back to an old French economist named Cantillon, is that there is no such thing as the quantity theory of inflation, in the sense that prices don't just rise uniformly. Okay, prices aren't dumped, or new dollars aren't dumped from the sky. These new dollars are injected into the economy at certain points, which means that inflation is a necessarily redistributive type of tax, because the people who are closest to the new money first get to spend that money before prices rise. So not only is inflation very damaging, not only is inflation undemocratic, but this type of inflation tax is fundamentally redistributive, and the people who benefit are those who get the new dollars first.
Yes, 100%. And so it's not only an unfair and undemocratic, but it also who sits at the front of the tap will benefit much more. You mentioned the Bank of Canada and their $3 billion of government bonds that they were buying in last
per
year.
week.
Yeah, sorry.
Per week.
Yeah, $3 billion a week.
That's just so you know, that's obviously changed, but I make that point because budget 2021 comes out, $3 billion deficit per week. 2 days later, the Bank of Canada announces it's purchasing $3 billion per week of government bonds. So I think that really calls into question just how independent the Bank of Canada is from the fiscal side of the government.
Well, I guess the question is, I guess Freeland wasn't able to go into the open market and sell those debt instruments because nobody was interested. And number two, because it's convertible into Canadian dollars, which are becoming more worthless. So they knew that their buying power was going to be eroded. And number two, it's very interesting that the Bank of Canada, when it was originally set up in the 30s, was actually a private institution. And within a couple of years, it was made into a public institution. But can you tell me, I mean, the political manifestation of monetary policy for our watchers is when the Bank of Canada makes a decision about interest rates, money supply, and things of that nature. Fiscal policy is when the government makes a decision on how to spend taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
No such thing as government funded. It's all taxpayer funded, in my opinion. But
well, it is.
It is. But like, how do we get more independence from the Bank of Canada? Is there a way to get the Bank of Canada to act more independently and not be politically driven?
Well, okay. I mean, look, I will be the first one to admit that I don't have all the answers on this. And I think this is fundamentally a very difficult, it's a difficult question, because it also raises the question of, well, should the Bank of Canada be independent? I mean, look, this institution is essentially tasked with stabilizing the value of our money, right? And keeping inflation low around the 2% target. Okay, well, these central bankers may have the keys to the car of the most important asset of our entire modern economy. Because think about it, every time you make an exchange, it relies on currency, it relies on dollars. So money, stable money, may be the most important part of an entire economy. So if you have these relatively few central bankers, especially like governors, deputy governor, who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, well, should they be independent from the people? If they're the ones who are tasked with overseeing the most important asset within a modern economy, should they just be left to do whatever they want? I mean, of course, that's not what happens, because they do have this mandate, but shouldn't they be held accountable when they fail to reach their mandate, which clearly this team in the Bank of Canada has done? I mean, look at inflation right now. Even according to the government's own numbers, it's close to 7%, 3 decades high, much higher than the 2% target. So look, I would just maybe question on to what degree should the Bank of Canada be independent from the people. Of course, there's the counter argument. Well, do you really want politicians to be having the keys to the car? Well, probably not, but at least they're held accountable every 4 years. Yeah. Or at least they have to face the voter. So I know I kind of just threw out more questions than I have answers, but I think it's something that we need to think about. Should they be independent, especially if they have all that control over the most important part of the economy?
Yeah, and I think that is the big concern, which is driving point number 5, is the legacy piece, is that because there is no stability in the economy based on what people have the confidence in the dollar. There certainly is an erosion of that confidence of the Canadian dollar to even a small degree. People are getting more concerned emotionally about their legacy, their future, their children, their grandchildren. And what kind of country are we going to with a very, to your point about the roads, no infrastructure. So if we don't have great infrastructure, we can't move goods and services. If we can't produce goods and services because of rolling lockdowns or anything like that, I think there's going to be, to your point earlier about, there's going to be a lot of PhD dissertations about this period in our history. Will we look back and say we did the very best we can? And I'm on the side of we didn't do the worst, but I don't think I would give us a failing grade nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it is going to raise a lot of questions. I mean, the one thing that we are trying to really scream, I guess, is that, look, either we make some tough decisions today, or you're going to have tougher decisions that are going to be forced on us. We've already seen how this plays out to a degree. Remember back in the 80s, you had politicians kicking the deficit can down the road, and then what happened in the early to mid 90s? Well, in the early to mid 90s, you had politicians and governments, all different levels, all different political stripes, were forced to make some very, very difficult decisions, right? You had the Progressive Conservatives in Alberta under the Klein government. You had the NDP government in Saskatchewan that had to close like 50 hospitals across the small prairie province. You had an Ontario with Harris. You had even the federal Liberals, remember Prime Minister Chrétien, the finance minister, Paul Martin, who warned that these deficits, they're not a matter of ideology. Compound interest is a matter of arithmetic, right? So either our politicians make some type of small and difficult decisions now, or tougher decisions are going to be forced on us and from external forces as well.
Yeah, it's either the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. And the pain of regret is a lot worse. Franco, what's the next step or next endeavors that you guys at the Canadian Taxpayer Federation are looking at and addressing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think inflation is going to be, look, inflation debt deficit is really going to be our bread and butter, right? We did the debt clock tour in March and April. That was awesome. We just did our gas tax honesty day. So check that out, taxpayer.com, and it shows that up to 38% of the pump price here in Canada is through taxes. And we just did our Teddy Waste Awards, where we hand out the best of the worst of government waste over the year. We have almost like a Grammy style award show. So that's always a lot of fun, and just poking fun at bureaucrats and politicians that are wasting our money. But moving forward, I think it's really still going to be a big focus on how do we get Canadians some much needed relief? Because look, you go to the gas pump now, you fuel up, and then you can barely afford to put ground beef in your grocery cart. Like, this is the issue that are really hammering Canadians. And let's face it, 7% inflation, it's not so bad when you're making $500K a year. 7% annual inflation is a game changer when you already are living paycheck to paycheck. Okay. So I think our role in this, especially over the next little while, is to show the government ways that they can make life a little bit more affordable, and continue to put the spotlight on inflation, debt deficits, and taxes.
Awesome. So if people want to find you, Canadian Taxpayers Federation, on a quick internet search on that interweb thing, and for other solutions from a financial planning perspective, how to save tax, how to keep your money safe from inflation, the erosion of the devaluation of your dollars, I would recommend that you head over to ibcanadagroup.ca, sign up for the masterclass, connect with one of our practitioners, and get some information. Franco, any closing thoughts that you want to share with the viewers, or anything else that you didn't address that you want to bring up?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for letting me speak to your audience. I really appreciate it. Please head over to taxpayer.com. Check out what we're doing. You can follow us on Twitter. Just search Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You can follow me on Twitter, Franco_nomics. And you can find us on Facebook. Just search Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and hope people got value out of this. I know I certainly did. So I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
IB Canada Group, your independent authority for information on the infinite banking concept.